Greetings to all the fighters, commissars, comrades, and all progressive forces in the African continent and the entire African diaspora. We also send our greetings to all the progressive socialist forces that are fighting against imperialism and capitalism in all parts of the world. Welcome to today's presentation, a lecture presentation, which is going to be an educational, instructive presentation of the cardinal pillar number 1 in the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. You would know that at the foundation of the economic freedom fighters is the founding manifesto that was adopted in the National Assembly on what is to be done, which is the founding conference of the EFF. That founding conference adopted the founding manifesto, and as part of the founding manifesto, and thereafter the constitution of the EFF are the 7 non-negotiable cardinal pillars. These are the principles, the political program that guides and underpin the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. And all fighters, all commissars, all sympathizers, all people who associate with the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime should internalize, they must understand the essence, the meaning of all these cardinal pillars. So as part of celebrating 7 years existence of the EFF in 2020, in July 2020, 26 July 2020, we are going to give a lecture series, meaning that we're going to have lectures, presentation in all the media platforms of the economic freedom fighters that are going to focus on the 7 cardinal pillars for economic freedom in our lifetime. So today we're starting with cardinal pillar number 1, which is expropriation of South Africa's land without compensation for equal redistribution in use. That is cardinal pillar number 1 in the economic freedom struggle, and all of us must understand the centrality of the land question. So we're going to talk to what does the founding manifesto of the EFF say about the land question. What is our approach? What do we mean when we say that the state must be custodian of all land and must redistribute it equally? Where do we come from? We must understand this context in clarity so that all of us have got deeper and better understanding of the cardinal pillars for economic freedom in our lifetime. You would know that we've got 7 cardinal pillars, and I want to take you through that briefly and indicate that other officials in the economic freedom fighters, inclusive of the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, the Treasurer General, and the National Chairperson, are going to come and present a lecture on each of those cardinal pillars. And then we'll come back to then present to round up on these issues. And this will culminate by the address of the Commander-in-Chief and President of the EFF on the 26th of July 2020. That will be the virtual rally of the economic freedom fighters. So under these conditions, so we have to adapt. It is a task of all revolutionaries to adapt or die. So that is what we're going to be dealing with. So the cardinal pillars which we're going to be presenting lecture series as part of hashtag EFF107, as part of celebrating the 7-year existence of the EFF, it's 1, expropriation of land without compensation for equal redistribution in use. Cardinal pillar number 2 is nationalization of mines, banks, and other strategic sectors of the economy without compensation. Cardinal pillar number 3 is building state and government capacity, which will lead to the abolishment of tenders. Cardinal pillar number 4 is provision of free quality education, healthcare, houses, and sanitation for all. Cardinal pillar number 5 is massive protected industrial development to create millions of sustainable jobs, including the introduction of minimum wages in order to close the wage gap between the rich and the poor, close the apartheid wage gap, and promote rapid career paths for Africans in the workplace. Cardinal pillar number 6 is massive development of the African economy and advocating for a move from reconciliation to justice in the entire African continent. Cardinal pillar number 7 is open, accountable, corrupt-free government and society without fear of victimization by state agencies. So on each of those cardinal pillars, we're going to go into depth to understand what do they mean and what is the political struggle that the economic freedom fighters is engaged in to enhance and harness, to take forward those cardinal pillars for economic freedom in our lifetime. Comrades, we have dealt in deeper detail when we dealt with the first book lecture on the land question and on the history of South Africa, of where we come from. So what we're going to do now is just to give a clearer context that when the colonial settlers had taken our land, had taken South Africa's land, had taken the land of the territory we call South Africa today, they then began to institutionalize the land dispossession through legislation. They passed so many laws. The colonial settlers, the white minority racist, nonsensical settlers, they used laws to institutionalize the expropriation of land which they had exercised over the black majority Africans, indigenous Africans. So that is what we must understand in context, that expropriation of land is not being advocated, and it is not going to happen for the first time in South Africa. The white colonial settlers expropriated the land of indigenous Africans without compensation. And what we are calling for is a morally and politically justifiable, economically justifiable expropriation of land without compensation, which is going to happen through the repossession of the land, which is still in the hands and control, total control of the colonial settlers and their descendants. So we as the EFF, when we speak about expropriation of land without compensation, we're talking about the repossession of the land without compensation for political, for economic, for social, for moral, for every proper historical justice purposes. And we're not apologetic about that determination, because that is the struggle which we say we have taken from those that fought and were defeated. We are still a conquered people. We are still a defeated people if we do not reclaim our land. So to have a struggle that does not have the return of the land to its rightful owners is to have no struggle at all. It means absolutely nothing. So the struggle for economic freedom at the center of everything is about the return of this primary economic resource called the land. And one thing that we must appreciate is that with the dispossession of land that has happened on Africans, a lot of indigenous people, of Africans, have been pushed to now believe that land is not important. They now believe that if you were to choose between a job and a land, they would want to rush for a job, which they can be fired anytime, which they can be easily disposed of, because that is what colonialism and apartheid has turned us to be cheap and easily disposable labor. They took our land so that we can be the cheap and easily disposable labor of the white capitalist wage system. And that is the narrative that we seek to change as the economic freedom fighters. And I said already that we have already dealt with the history of colonialism and illustrated vividly that long before, 400,000 years before the arrival of colonial settlers who intentionally occupied our land in the 1652, there was existence of all Africans, of indigenous Africans in this political territory we call South Africa today. And that includes the Khoi and the San. It includes all the Africans who are residing here in this territory we call South Africa today. So the colonial narrative, the colonial historical narrative wants to portray a picture that the settlement of black people here in the territory we call South Africa is a result of mass migration. That is pure rubbish. It's nonsense. We have always been here. We have always had our own forms of civilization. We always had our own forms of subsistence. We had our own forms of criminal existence. We had primary existence. We knew about agriculture. We knew about mining. We knew about all these things long before the arrival of colonialists. And as we said before, the colonialists arrived, and because of military superiority, they defeated us. We won 1 or 2 battles, but the war we lost. We won some of the battles in the struggles, in the resistance movement. The resistance movement which began with the Khoi that fought against Francisco de Almeida in 1510, defeated him. It was a battle victory. There are so many victories, there are so many battles that were fought between the colonial invaders and the indigenous people. But the overall assessment of the war is that we were defeated. But are we still defeated now? We must not agree to stay in a defeated state. We must continue to fight until we reclaim our land, we reclaim what rightfully belongs to the indigenous population. I'm just going to highlight, comrades, that as part of taking the land from us, as part of forcing black people out of the land, once they dispossessed us, the colonial system, they passed the Glen Grey Act in 1894, which said that even with the small pieces of land which black indigenous Africans occupied, they must pay tax to the colonial regime. And they were forcing black Africans into waged labor. So you had no choice, because if you did not pay the tax, they were going to utilize the violence. They were going to ban your household, your huts, your everywhere where you stayed. They will dispossess you of the animals, because they did not want Africans to live out of the nature which they had harvested sustainably, because there was no need for this wage labor. So then they passed the Glen Grey Act, which then forced a lot of Africans into wage labor. But also in the Natal, they passed legislations that forced Africans to go and work for a wage, for a salary. It was a forceful fight, and that is the reason Bambata was killed and beheaded in 1906. It was part of forcing us off the land so that we can become the slaves in the emerging, the nonsense capitalist system that was beginning to emerge here in South Africa. So that is what they did. But also they had something called the Squatters Law Act, which was basically saying that black people who are not in the employ of white people are squatters. They are not allowed to exist in the so-called white territories in South Africa. You would know that they passed a legislation called the Native Reserve Location Act, the Crown Land Disposal Ordinance. The South African Act of 1909 was now a formalization of the dispossession that had occurred through colonialism. So after the so-called Anglo-Boer War, which is the South African War, the British Parliament passed the South African Act of 1909 in the British Parliament to establish the Union of South Africa, to establish the whites-only Union of South Africa, to say that this territory we call South Africa is a British dominion. That was formalization of expropriation of land without compensation by the white colonial settlers. So we were expropriated of our land, of our existence. They took our animals, they took everything from us through later on legislation in the manner that it is. And then they passed the Land Settlement Act in 1912. The deliberations began in 1912. And you will know then they passed the infamous Natives Land Act in 1913, which gave only 7% of the land to the indigenous population. So the indigenous population in 1913 were about 5 million in South Africa in terms of the number of people. And whites were about 300,000. But they took 93% of the land to themselves through law. And then they only gave 7% of the land to the black majority, to the indigenous majority. And even stated in that law, in the 1913 Natives Land Act, that a native shall not enter into any agreement or transaction for the purchase, hire, or other acquisition from a person other than a native, or any such land, or any other right thereto, interest and outside of servitude. So this is the context of what happens. They take 93% of the land through law. They give the indigenous people 7%. And in the law that says that black people have got 7% of the land, they then say that natives are not allowed to buy land from the white colonial settlers. They can exchange land amongst themselves only. That is what that section of Section 1A of the Natives Land Act says. It says a native shall not enter into any agreement or transaction for the purchase of hire or acquisition from any other person other than a native of any land. That is what it says. Like, it's legislation which was passed to dispossess to formalize the dispossession of the African indigenous population, ourselves, in the manner that it is. And from there on, they then passed a lot of other legislations that banished Africans, that gave the colonial governments, the colonial rulers, the power to expel Africans from the areas that are designated as white areas. There are so many laws that were passed, including the Bantu Administration Act, like the so-called Self-Government Act, which created the Bantu stands. It was a way of reducing all of us into insignificance. And in 1936, they passed a law called, it's an amendment of the 1913 Land Act, which then said, let's increase from 7% to 13% the allocation of land to the indigenous Africans. And that 13% allocation of land, from 1936, it was so until 1994. Even in 1996, there had not been so major changes in terms of what should happen with the land question in South Africa. And you would know that at the center of South Africa's transition was the colonial settlers' intention to take and retain their ownership of the land. So they were not interested later on all these other things. They were just grandstanding, but the major aspect of the CODESA process was to retain ownership of the land in white hands. That is what they did in terms of what we got to ultimately achieve. That is why they actually agreed on a property clause in both the interim constitution and in the permanent constitution, which was adopted in 1996. Now, this is the 1996 constitution, which is containing one of the most regressive and the most reactionary problematic clauses called Section 25 of the Constitution. It is the most problematic, the most ahistorical, the most dangerous section of the Constitution, because it fails to recognize that there was colonialism in South Africa. Basically, what Section 25 does is to reinvent, is to institutionalize the massive land inequalities, the massive land hunger that happened on Africans due to colonial dispossession. That is why it says as part of subsection 7 that for restitution purposes, that a person or community dispossessed of property after 19 June 1913 as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled to the extent provided by an act of parliament either to restitution or to some equitable redress. Now that is problematic because it now assumes that only after the 19th of June 1913 that the land was taken from our people. A lot of people lost the land long before 1913. We have explained that historical context. What 1913 was institutionalization, was legislation of racist laws in a manner that excludes the black majority, Africans in particular, indigenous Africans in particular. We're going to read and give a clearer context to the entire Section 25 when we come to the solutions of what is to be done, what must happen in terms of the EFF Founding Manifesto on the cardinal pillar number 1, which is expropriation of land without compensation for equal redistribution in use. Now, comrades, it is important that we must highlight some of the key issues that, so despite this sell-out Section 25, the Constitution also says in Section 9.2, the so-called the Equality Clause, it says that equality includes the full and equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. To promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. So we have got an obligation as now Parliament, as revolutionaries, to utilize Parliament to undo the injustices of the past, to undo colonialism. So that is one thing that we must understand, that we are not crying, we are not crybabies. We are not crybabies as the economic freedom fighters. That is why we are existing to contest political power. That is why we use Parliament to undo colonialism, to change the unequal power relations in terms of the control of the economy of the land. And we must decisively do so. We'll explain in conclusion in terms of what is our path to power and what is the role of all of us as activists of the EFF in the address to the land question. And we have to use legislation to undo the injustices of the past. There is an interesting quote which we want to bring to your attention. There's a book which was discussing race relations in Britain, but there's a very profound quote which is important in terms of understanding the significance of legislation. It says that legislation alone cannot create relations or change attitudes, but it can set clear standards of acceptable behavior and provide redress for those who have suffered in the hands of others. If law can play a repressive role by sanctioning racial segregation and discrimination as it has done in Nazi Germany, the American South, Rhodesia, and South Africa, it can operate with equal force in the opposite direction by declaring that equality of opportunity, regardless of race or color, is to be pursued as a major social objective. It is a statement of public policy by a parliament intended to influence public opinion. Now, that is very important in terms of highlighting that we can use legislation to have equal force against these racist laws. The 1913 Land Act, there's so many legislations that took the land from the black majority, the indigenous people. We can choose another option. We can choose to just go and occupy the land without any orderly forms. We can just say, no, let's go tomorrow and take the land violently and we'll take it for our own purpose. But that is not going to achieve the equal redistribution component of the cardinal pillar for economic freedom in our lifetime. Comrades, however, let's give you quickly the context of how land reform in Zimbabwe got to happen. Zimbabwe was in this kind of arrangements with the British that were going to give you money to buy back the land from the white colonial settlers in your own country. After they had transitioned from the Rhodesian colonialism, from the British colonialism, which was begun or started by Cecil John Rhodes. That is why he named Zimbabwe and Zambia after himself, Rhodesia, in terms of what it is. But what happened in Zimbabwe is when the military veterans realized that government had no courage to redistribute the land after Britain had reneged, had turned back on the compensation commitments which they made. The military there in Zimbabwe said, no, we must go and take the land by force from these white farmers. And they indeed did that. They took land by force. In some instances, there were very few people who were injured. Some of them correctly injured. The land was taken, but there was no set method in terms of redistribution of who gains access to what and what value are they going to add to the land and whether they even have interest in adding value to the land. So there was no clear legislation in the beginning of the land reform program in Zimbabwe. It was not a constitutional effort that was pursued in Zimbabwe. And we must say this so that we are able to distinguish what we're going to do in South Africa with what happened in Zimbabwe. And then the government of Zimbabwe had two options. So that time, President Mugabe had an option of either going to arrest the military veterans or to join them in taking the land from the colonial settlers. And then the government of Zimbabwe, under President R.G. Mugabe, joined the militant, fearless forces in taking back the land in the manner that it is. But the redistribution program was not proper. The land did not benefit majority. It benefited primarily the Politburo and the Central Committee of ZANU-PF. And that is not the land reform program that we are calling for in South Africa. We are calling for a land reform that is going to come with a change of the constitution, but it's also going to be buttressed properly by legislation in terms of what should happen. That is why even when we call for the occupation of land now, we call for occupation of land, of unoccupied land. Because we are still saying, comrades, let us exhaust this constitutional democracy and systems that have been provided with 1994. They sold out in 1994. Let us take political power from them so that we can reverse the sell-out positions that they'd taken in that particular context. And that is how it is in the manner that we were dealing with. So our approach now is to change the constitution, and you need political power to change the constitution. We want to move away from this problematic and very shallow approach to land reform, which is taken by the ruling party. The ruling party's approach to land reform from 1994 has always been what is said in subsections 5, 6, and 7 of the Constitution. So their first component is on land redistribution, which is basically to buy back the land or to buy the land from white people and give to black people. Majority of the times, the people who are supposed to be receiving the land are not even receiving it, because the white colonial settlers continue to do an occupation of that particular land. The case in Malamala, in Mpumalanga, the land was bought for R1 billion by government. It's supposed to be given to a community, but it is not in the hands of the community. The whites who used to occupy that land are continuing to occupy it now. And that is a pillar of the ruling party's approach. They have spent billions of rands buying land from the colonial settlers, and still nothing. The land ownership, architecture, and face has not changed in South Africa. The other pillar is something called land tenure, where they must guarantee the security of tenure of those who are occupying land. And we know as a matter of fact that a substantial number of black people do not have the security of tenure in the lands that they occupy for residential or whatever purpose. So the farm dwellers do not have security of tenure when the farm is sold to a new white owner. They say we no longer want these workers, we want to use the land for something else. So farmers do not have security of tenure. Informal settlement dwellers do not have security of tenure. That is why they are evicted every day. They are just harassed every day. A lot of, even imagine, black middle class who are buying houses through banks do not have security of tenure. The security of tenure, the title deeds are with the banks. But that is supposed to be a pillar of this land reform program that guarantees our people access to land. And the other component which is problematic is the one on land restitution, because it is based on the false supposition that land dispossession started on the 19th of June 1913. That is subsection 7 of section 25. It is entirely problematic, and we cannot live with such. We should oppose such. We need to gain political power so that we can remove all these sections and then come with proper revolutionary sections in terms of what we must deal with. And as I said, comrades, the founding manifesto, when it deals with the character of the EFF, what is the character of the EFF? In paragraph 33, it says that the EFF will be involved in mass movements and community protests that seek for the betterment of people's lives. The EFF will also associate with movements that demand land through land occupation, aimed at making the message clear that our people need land. That is what the founding manifesto of the EFF says. So land occupation is part of the program of the EFF. We are not apologetic about that, but that does not replace the fact that we want to constitutionally change the constitution and then pass legislation that is going to ensure that all our people have got equitable access to the land of South Africa. Then in the further substantiation of expropriation of land without compensation for equitable redistribution, there are 6 paragraphs that define the EFF's approach to the land question. And that starts from paragraph 39 to paragraph 45 of the founding manifesto of the EFF. Paragraph 39 says that the EFF's approach to the land expropriation without compensation question is that all land should be transferred to the ownership and custodianship of the state in a similar way that the mineral and petroleum resources were transferred to the ownership and custodianship of the state through the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002. And maybe just to dwell on that in terms of the custodianship, in terms of what does the EFF say in terms of that, what is the context of state custodianship. And what is this Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act that we're talking about? So the Section 3(1) of the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act says that the mineral and petroleum resources are the common heritage of all people of South Africa, and the state is the custodian thereof for the benefit of all South Africans. So you have got a law already in South Africa that has taken the custodianship of all the mineral resources to the state, such that whoever wants to be involved in mining must apply for a permission to do so. So we've got already a foundation in terms of how we can deal with this particular question. So it's not something unusual. It's not something that has never happened in the manner that it is. So we need to then do to what was done to mineral resources to the land question. The reason why we choose the custodianship approach is because the piece by piece restitution or distribution or repossession process has dismally failed and will fail forever. That is a fact, comrades. We must accept that in 1996, the current government had intention to redistribute 30% of the land by 2004. And 2004 arrived, they said, no, let's shift the goalposts to 2014. Even in 2014, they had not reached the 30%. It's 2020 now, they have not reached the 30%, which they had intention to redistribute. Why? It's because you are identifying piece by piece, and majority of that approach is subjected to litigation and unreasonable sick demands by the colonial settlers, demanding billions of rands for land which they didn't purchase. So we need to repossess the whole of South Africa and say the whole of South Africa, like all the minerals, are under the custodianship of the state. We must make sure that the whole land in South Africa is under the custodianship of the state, and we must have proper guarantees on security of tenure on residential settlements. So the state, when it is in a custodian of all land, must not go around dispossessing people's houses. It must not abuse people. So there must be proper legislative framework that will guarantee equal distribution of the land in a manner that is much more sustainable. So that is how we're going to then deal with this question. But also, if you look into the National Water Act of 1998, it says that the state is the custodian of all water in South Africa. Whoever wants to harvest water, even if you want to build your own dam, you must know that you need water rights, you need permission from the state. Why are we not doing that to the land question? So that we can have equitable access, all of us. The approach of repossessing land piece by piece does not work, has never worked anywhere. That is why paragraph 39 of the Economic Freedom Fighters Founding Manifesto says we must have the state custodianship of our land so that we can be able to then deal with all of these issues. What have we done with all these things in terms of achieving this perspective? We, as the Economic Freedom Fighters in Parliament, on the 27th of February 2018, we led a motion in Parliament, which was led by the Commander-in-Chief and President Julius Malema, which was adopted. And that adoption of Parliament meant that we must start the process of amending Section 25 of the Constitution. And when the Parliament adopted that resolution, it said two things which are important to highlight. It said that we must establish a constitutional review committee which must primarily do two things. One, review and amend Section 25 of the Constitution to make it possible for the state to expropriate land in the public interest without compensation, and in the process conduct public hearings to get the views of ordinary South Africans, policymakers, civil society organizations and academics about the necessity of and mechanisms for expropriating land without compensation. That is what Parliament agreed upon through a motion which was led by the economic freedom fighters. But also it says as part of that resolution that the Constitutional Review Committee must propose the necessary constitutional amendment with regards to the kind of future land tenure regime needed, taking into account the necessity of the state being the custodian of all South African land. Let's repeat that. It says the Constitutional Review Committee must propose the necessary constitutional amendments with regards to the kind of future land tenure regime needed, taking into account the necessity of the state being a custodian of all South African land. That is what Parliament has mandated the Constitutional Review Committee to then deal with in the manner that it is. And then the Constitutional Review Committee was established, conducted public hearings in all parts of South Africa, received not less than 450,000 submissions, and even conducted public hearings in Parliament, where more than 60 organizations came to Parliament to present their views on the land question. And then on the 15th of November 2018, the National Assembly, which is one of the houses in Parliament, adopted a Constitutional Review Committee report, which amongst other things said that Section 25 of the Constitution must be amended to make explicit that which is implicit in the Constitution with regards to expropriation of land without compensation as a legitimate option for land reform, so as to address the historic wrongs caused by the arbitrary disposition of land, and in doing so, ensure equitable access to land and further empower the majority of South Africans to be productive participants in ownership, food security, and agricultural reform programs. It further said that Parliament must urgently establish a mechanism to effect the necessary amendments to the relevant part of Section 24 of the Constitution. And Parliament must table, process, and table a constitutional amendment bill before the end of the 5th Democratic Parliament. That is what was said in 2018. Now, this is the process which Parliament necessarily must follow. So the Constitutional Review Committee can do public hearings, get submissions, but the Constitutional Review Committee can't just amend the Constitution. There must be an ad hoc committee. An ad hoc committee is an interim committee in Parliament, which must enact something called a constitutional amendment bill. Bill means a law that is still in the Parliament, has not been passed into an act of Parliament. So what we have now is a process to enact a constitutional amendment bill with an agreement already that we must amend Section 25 of the Constitution to permit for expropriation of land without compensation. Now, there are things that distinguish the EFF's position to the ruling party's position, because the ruling party's position, they still think naively, they are still gullible to the belief that you can say, let us allow for expropriation without compensation in the Constitution, but you must still pursue the route of piece by piece expropriation. Meaning that you can just say, no, let us expropriate Van Tonder today, Van der Merwe tomorrow. They will take you to court and you're going to be there for a very long time. And that is unlike when you were to take the state to be custodian of all of South Africa's land. In the same way, it is the custodian of all South Africa's minerals and petroleum resources. In the same way, it is the custodian of all of South Africa's water. What is wrong? What is difficult about having the state as the custodian of all of South Africa's land? Because the approach of piece by piece will not work, will be subjected to permanent litigations and court challenges that are going to undermine the essence of what we stand for and what we seek to achieve as the economic freedom fighters. But also the founding manifesto of the EFF highlights some of the key issues in relation to agrarian reform. So most comrades tend to confuse agrarian reform and land reform. So agrarian reform speaks to what form of agricultural policy, what form of policy of the food economy do you adopt in the manner that it is. Then the EFF founding manifesto says that for agricultural purposes, the state must incentivize that those who are involved in the production of food must play a central role. One, by providing agricultural implements to all the people who are going to be involved in food production. That is what the founding manifesto of the EFF says. It also says that the state must purchase all food from the producers that it has empowered. Meaning that if we have empowered you with land, we have given you agricultural implements to produce cabbages or tomatoes or whatever you produce, the state must primarily buy food from the small-scale farmers and whatever size farmers that now have been given access to the land. The reason why a lot of black people are now not participating at ownership level in terms of agriculture. Black people, in a way, are majority of farmers because they are the ones who work the land here in South Africa. But in terms of ownership, it's whites. And the reason why a lot of black people do not see the need to own the farms is because they do not have access to the entire agricultural food value chain. So the state must have systems of assisting all the farmers with abattoirs, for those who are stock farming. So if you grow cattle, goats, sheep, and all of those, you must gain free access to abattoirs. So that when you gain access to an abattoir, when you have got your cattle, instead of it being sold for 7,000 rand or 5,000 rand, you can make even a minimum of 30,000 rand out of now a processed meat. You still even keep the skin and whatever thing you can keep because you would have been guaranteed access. But also even in terms of maize meal, the state must help all the producers of maize meal with access to the processing of maize meal. All food processing must be available for all those who are involved in agriculture. That is what the founding manifesto of the EFF and the subsequent election manifestos of the EFF say. But also the state must be the off-taker of all the food that is produced by our people. By the way, government is the single biggest buyer of food because it has got school feeding schemes, it has got hospitals, it has got prisons. It has got so many areas where food consumption is very high. So if there is a guarantee that in you being involved in agriculture, you will then realize the value of the land. Instead of every time when we say there must be an opportunity for land, you say, no, I'm not looking for a land. I'm looking for a job where they're going to pay you 4,500 or even 2,000 rand. But if you had access to land, You are given agricultural implements. You are given the seed capital to harvest the land. We can then have systems that will meaningfully empower you. Then you will begin to realize that there is no need for you to protest for an RDP house, because you have generated enough money out of your own land. You will build your own beautiful house. You will then realize that there is no need to fight for petty things. The land question is at the center of our struggle, and we should be in pursuit of that particular struggle. That is what the founding manifesto of the economic freedom fighters obliges all of us to do. And we must read, comrades, all the times in terms of all of these issues. And we must not be confused to think that we have achieved this battle. It will not end now. It's a battle that we must be engaged in consistently. And this does not substitute that in the immediate we have a program as the EFF to occupy unoccupied land. We have not yet taken a decision to occupy occupied land, but also that was going to come with a lot of dynamics. We still have a position, and there are successes that have been recorded, of settlements that have been recorded because of the courageous fighting spirit of the ground forces of the EFF in all parts of South Africa. We are pursuing this struggle now through Parliament because we want to change the Constitution so that we can have the equal force to then take back our land, and then we give it to all our people. Now, we have to talk the politics. How do we get there? How do we get there? The very formation of the economic freedom fighters is at the center of the land struggles. So one, we must build very strong organization, dependable organization, with political and ideological clarity. You can't be a fighter that doesn't understand the depth, the width of what the economic freedom fighter stands for. Because we need a very strong, dependable organization, a solid organization that exists at all levels, at branch level, at sub-regional level, at regional level, provincial level, national level, with leadership at all levels, including at VD level, who are aware of what is our responsibilities as commissars, as leaders of the organization. You can't be a leader of the organization that doesn't understand what it stands for. You can't be an organizational leader who every time must be fed about basic things that you must understand by yourself. So we need a strong organization. It is only through a strong organization that will be able to gain access to mass power. So we have organizational power, then we gain mass power. Mass power, it means the masses, the people, will be behind the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. It means that the land struggle will find resonance with our people. That is what it is. The revolution needs numbers. We need, in a revolution, size matters. I don't know where it doesn't matter, but in a revolution, the number of people who follow the revolution matters. So it is important that we must have an organization that exists everywhere so that we can have mass power. Mass power is going to give us political power. What is political power? It's what we partially have now. Participation in councils, in legislatures, in parliament. But if we have got majority of the people behind us, we are going to then take over political power. We will then be able to introduce legislation and constitutional amendments that are going to achieve all these things that we say we are achieving. And that is now taking state power. And then we use the state power to take economic power. Economic power is to take back the land, is to nationalize the mines, banks, and other strategic sectors of the economy. Because we have to amend the nonsensical Section 25 of the Constitution. We have to amend the sell-out positions of the ruling party. There's no other way to say it, comrades, that South Africa's transition, South Africa's so-called democracy, was achieved through some sell-out collaboration with the white capitalist establishment. That is what it is. We can praise Nelson Mandela for whatever he has done and all of those things, but at his latter age, and later on when they were busy looking for political power, they compromised the center of the struggles of black people, which is the land question. And we must say that we were sold out on the land question. And that must change. That is why Section 25 of the Constitution currently says no one may be deprived of property except in terms of law of general application. And that property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application for a public purpose or in the public interest, and subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment of which have either been agreed to or by the means by those affected or decided or approved by court. That is the political document. That is a political settlement which was reached that says that if we want to take back our land, it must be subject to compensation. They've been compensating the land. They've been taking the land, they've been paying. But what do we have now? 26 years of democracy. We have a situation where only 8% of the land was bought from white people by the democratic government. A government which is supposed to protect everyone. 8% in 26 years. So it means that in 52 years, it will be 16%. The 30% will be achieved in 100 years' time. Now, comrades, here's one thing which all of us must appreciate in terms of our understanding that we must never ever compromise the unity and the coherence, the strength of the organization, because it is the only fighting tool in the hands of black people, not only in South Africa, but in the entire African continent and diaspora. There's never been a revolutionary, militant, fearless organization than the EFF, which is relentlessly and fearlessly fighting for black people's liberation. Why? Because everywhere black people are found, are a lesser race, was still treated with disdain. We do not have control of our own economies. We do not have control of our own land. If the world economy is worth 100 rands, black people do not even account for 1 rand of that global economy. We are still suppliers of cheap and easily disposable labor. And every time we say, do you want the land? You say, no, I don't want the land, I want a job. You want to continue to be the slaves of the white capitalist establishment. Even the philosophy of the current government is to say, let us go and look for white people to come and invest, to employ us as slaves. Because when Ramaphosa is going around saying he's looking for investments, he's not going to speak to black people out there in the world. He is there to look for whites to come and enslave us further. We don't have our land. We don't have our land, and that is one issue that we must look into. 7 years into existence, the EFF is making strides in terms of the land question. Let us continue to build the organization even during these difficult times of COVID-19 lockdowns. Let us continue to reproduce ourselves ideologically and politically. The task of every ground force of the EFF, The task of every revolutionary ground force, of every member, every leader of the EFF is ideological and political reproduction. We must reproduce ourselves. We do not want barren fighters and commissars. We want fighters that are going to reproduce themselves so that we can illustrate to the entire world that black people can emancipate themselves. And we can only do so once we've got access to the land. When we speak later on about the development of the African economy, we're going to illustrate to you that the entire African economy is possibly the same size as France's economy only. And how does France get to that position? Because of the wealth that they've taken from Africa. Our land, our minerals continue to be looted. And we act like there is nothing wrong about that. So comrades, this was a presentation of the land question to contextualize the EFF founding manifesto as part of celebrating the 7 years existence of the economic freedom fighters. I think we have dealt justice for this inaugural lecture, and we're going to then listen to all the other commissars, the leadership of the EFF. We're going to speak to all the pillars. But also, we must constitute platforms at sub-regional, regional, branch, provincial levels where we interact in terms of these questions. We must, all of us, interact on all the cardinal pillars so that we understand the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us for this session. We are sure that we will further interact on various other questions. These are ongoing discussions. And one thing that is important about political education is that it is constant. Immediately you plug yourself off the political education content, you are going to believe and want to reason through so-called common sense, which majority of the times is common nonsense. So don't trap yourself into some lily white fears that if we take our land, we're going to be like Zimbabwe. We're not going to be like Zimbabwe in the manner in which it was handled in any way. Zimbabwe was worsened by the imperialist interventions and interference that got to destabilize a land program which otherwise is not worth emulating because it was not founded on values of socialism. Our struggle for land reform is squarely located within the struggle, the socialist struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime. We've already said that this is consistent with our Marxist, Leninist, and Fanonian perspective in terms of the land question. Comrades, let us continue to engage in terms of these questions. Thank you very much for joining us. We will meet in the next engagements. The next lecture which is coming is going to be focusing on nationalization of mines, banks, and other strategic sectors of the economy as a cardinal pillar for economic freedom in our lifetime. Thank you very much for joining us. Amanda.